My name is Denise Webb. I'm 26 years old, and during our family's traditional Sunday dinner, my parents Margaret and Frank Webb casually announced they would be using my entire $680,000 trust fund to pay off my brother Jason's massive gambling debts because he made some mistakes and needs family support to get back on track, while I should be grateful to help and proud to make such a meaningful family sacrifice by liquidating my entire financial future for his irresponsible choices. What my parents didn't know was that their shocking betrayal of my inheritance was about to backfire spectacularly, because I had anticipated this exact scenario months earlier when Jason's gambling addiction became obvious, and I had already quietly transferred my entire trust fund to an offshore account that they could never access, no matter how many withdrawal papers they expected me to sign. The trust fund that would become the center of my family's most devastating betrayal had been established by my grandmother Eleanor Webb when I was 8 years old, specifically designed to provide financial security and educational opportunities that would allow me to build an independent life based on my own goals, rather than being limited by economic circumstances or family financial pressures. Grandmother Eleanor had been a successful businesswoman who understood the importance of financial independence for women, and she had structured my trust fund with careful legal provisions that would protect the money from family interference, while ensuring that it would be available when I reached adulthood and could make mature decisions about my financial future. Denise, this money represents 40 years of my business work, and I want it to give you choices that I never had. Grandmother Eleanor had explained to me during one of our conversations about financial planning and personal independence. This trust fund will allow you to pursue your dreams without worrying about money, and it will give you the security to make decisions based on what you want rather than what you can afford. The trust fund had grown steadily over the years through careful investment management, reaching $680,000 by the time I gained full access at age 25. This money represented not just financial security, but also my grandmother's belief in my potential and her commitment to ensuring that I would have opportunities to create a meaningful and independent life. My plans for the trust fund were both practical and ambitious, including a down payment on a home, investment in further education and professional development, and the establishment of my own small business that would provide both personal fulfillment and financial independence. The money would allow me to take calculated risks and pursue opportunities that wouldn't be possible if I were limited by student loans or financial insecurity. But more than the practical benefits, the trust fund represented my grandmother's love and her understanding that financial independence was essential for personal freedom and the ability to make choices based on values rather than necessity. She had seen too many women limited by economic dependence, and she was determined that I would have the resources to build whatever life I chose. My relationship with my family had always been complicated by their differential treatment of me and my older brother Jason, who had consistently received more attention, support, and financial assistance, despite his pattern of irresponsible behavior and poor decision-making that had created problems throughout his adult life. Jason's gambling addiction had been developing for several years, beginning with casual sports betting and gradually escalating to more serious gambling that consumed increasing amounts of his income, while creating debt obligations that threatened his financial stability and personal relationships. My parents' response to Jason's gambling problem had been predictable, based on their lifelong pattern of enabling his irresponsible behavior, while expecting me to be understanding and supportive of their efforts to protect him from the consequences of his own choices. "Jason is going through a difficult time right now," my mother Margaret would say whenever his gambling losses created financial crises that required family intervention. "He's learned his lesson, and he just needs some help getting back on his feet so he can move forward with his life." My father Frank's approach to Jason's gambling addiction was equally enabling, treating each crisis as an isolated incident rather than recognizing the pattern of destructive behavior that was creating increasingly serious problems for Jason and for the family members who kept rescuing him from consequences. "Everyone makes mistakes, and family members should support each other during difficult periods," Frank would explain whenever Jason needed financial assistance to cover gambling losses or other problems created by his addiction. Jason is a good person who just needs guidance and support to overcome this temporary setback. But I had been watching Jason's gambling addiction escalate for months, and I could see that my parents' enabling responses were making the problem worse rather than encouraging him to seek proper treatment or take responsibility for his destructive choices. The warning signs had been obvious to anyone who was paying attention. Jason's increasingly desperate requests for money, his evasive answers about his financial situation, his mood swings that corresponded to gambling wins and losses, and his general pattern of irresponsibility that suggested his addiction was controlling his behavior rather than being controlled by him. More concerning was Jason's increasing sense of entitlement about family financial support, as if his gambling losses created obligations for other family members to sacrifice their own financial security to solve problems that he had created through his own irresponsible choices. "The family has money available through Denise's trust fund," Jason had said during a recent conversation about his financial problems, apparently viewing my inheritance as a family resource that should be available to solve his gambling debts. "It's not fair for her to have all that money sitting there while I'm dealing with serious financial problems that could be easily solved." The casual way Jason referenced my trust fund as potential solution to his gambling debts had immediately raised red flags about his expectations and my parents' potential willingness to sacrifice my financial future to enable his continued irresponsible behavior. That's when I began taking protective measures to ensure that my trust fund would remain secure, regardless of family pressure or manipulation that might be designed to force me to sacrifice my financial independence for Jason's temporary relief from consequences he had created through his own choices. Working with financial advisors and legal professionals who specialized in trust protection and asset security, I quietly began the process of transferring my inheritance to offshore accounts and investment structures that would be completely protected from family pressure, legal challenges, or any other attempts to access money that was legally and morally mine. Ms. Webb, trust fund protection is a common concern for beneficiaries who anticipate family pressure to redistribute their inheritance, explained attorney Patricia Williams during my consultation about asset protection strategies. There are legitimate legal mechanisms that allow you to protect your financial security while maintaining compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. The offshore trust structure that I established was both comprehensive and completely legal, providing multiple layers of protection that would make it impossible for my family to access my money, regardless of any pressure tactics, emotional manipulation, or legal proceedings they might attempt to force me to surrender my financial independence. Have you ever anticipated family betrayal so clearly that you took protective action months before the betrayal actually occurred? That's exactly what I was doing as I watched Jason's gambling addiction escalate and my parents' enabling behavior intensify, preparing for the moment when they would try to sacrifice my financial future to solve problems created by his irresponsible choices. The Sunday dinner where my parents would reveal their true intentions about my trust fund was approaching, but my inheritance was already safely protected from their plans to steal my financial independence for Jason's temporary relief from gambling consequences. The traditional Sunday dinners at my parents' house had been a weekly family obligation for as long as I could remember, providing a regular opportunity for Margaret and Frank to maintain their image as devoted parents while managing family dynamics and addressing whatever crises or challenges were affecting their preferred child, Jason. These gatherings had become increasingly uncomfortable for me as Jason's gambling addiction escalated, and my parents' enabling responses became more obvious, but I continued attending because I wanted to maintain family relationships, and because these dinners provided valuable intelligence about my family's attitudes and intentions regarding financial matters that might affect my own security. The particular Sunday dinner that would expose my parents' willingness to sacrifice my trust fund for Jason's gambling debts began normally enough, with Margaret serving her usual elaborate meal while Frank held court about his opinions on current events and family matters that he felt required his guidance and wisdom. Jason's demeanor during dinner was unusually relaxed and confident, suggesting that he knew something positive was about to happen that would resolve his current financial crisis without requiring him to take responsibility for his gambling addiction or make the difficult changes necessary for genuine recovery. "How are things going with your work situation, Jason?" Margaret asked during the meal, clearly leading up to some kind of announcement about his employment status and financial circumstances that would justify whatever family intervention they were planning. "Things are looking much better, Mom," Jason replied with obvious satisfaction about developments that he apparently expected would solve his problems without requiring personal accountability or behavior changes. "I should be able to get caught up on everything pretty soon with some family support and understanding." The casual reference to family support while looking directly at me made it clear that Jason expected his financial problems to be solved through my resources rather than his own efforts or genuine commitment to addressing his gambling addiction through proper treatment and behavior modification. But it was the look of complicit understanding that passed between my parents and Jason that confirmed my suspicions about their coordinated plan to pressure me into sacrificing my trust fund for his temporary relief from consequences that would return as long as his addiction remained untreated. "Actually, we wanted to discuss some family financial planning with you today, Denise," Frank announced as we finished the main course, his tone carrying the authoritative weight he used when making family decisions that he expected me to accept without argument or resistance. "Your brother Jason has encountered some temporary financial difficulties that require family assistance," Margaret added, using the euphemistic language that characterized her approach to Jason's repeated crises and failures. "We've been discussing how the family can work together to help him get back on his feet and move forward successfully." The characterization of Jason's gambling debts as temporary financial difficulties rather than consequences of destructive addiction revealed my parents' continued refusal to acknowledge the seriousness of his problem or the futility of providing financial solutions that didn't address his underlying behavioral issues. "Jason has made some mistakes with his money management, but he's learned important lessons and is ready to make better choices going forward," Frank continued, apparently believing that Jason's gambling addiction could be solved through family financial intervention rather than professional treatment and genuine behavior modification. "The problem is that Jason owes some money to creditors who are becoming impatient about repayment schedules," Margaret explained, using language that suggested legitimate business debts rather than gambling losses to dangerous people who were threatening Jason with serious consequences for his failure to pay. But the most revealing aspect of their presentation was their obvious confidence that I would agree to whatever solution they had developed, apparently believing that family pressure and emotional manipulation would convince me to sacrifice my financial independence for Jason's temporary relief from problems he had created. "We've identified a solution that will solve Jason's immediate problems while ensuring that family relationships remain strong and supportive," Frank announced, clearly building up to the revelation that would expose their willingness to steal my inheritance for Jason's gambling debts. "Your trust fund provides exactly the resources that Jason needs to resolve his current difficulties and start fresh with better financial management," Margaret said, finally revealing their intention to liquidate my entire financial future for Jason's temporary convenience and continued irresponsibility. The casual way they announced their plan to steal my inheritance, as if my trust fund was family money that should be available for Jason's gambling debts, rather than my personal financial security that my grandmother had specifically protected for my individual benefit, was both shocking and predictable based on their lifelong pattern of sacrificing my interests for Jason's comfort. $680,000 is exactly enough to cover Jason's debts and give him some additional cushion for rebuilding his financial situation, Frank continued, apparently having calculated precisely how much of my inheritance would be required to solve Jason's current crisis, without considering the long-term implications for his addiction or my financial independence. "You don't really need that money right now since you have a good job and stable income," Margaret added, dismissing my financial planning and personal goals as less important than Jason's immediate relief from consequences that would return as soon as he resumed gambling with his problems temporarily solved. The suggestion that my steady employment somehow disqualified me from benefiting from my own inheritance, while Jason's unemployment and irresponsibility created claims on my resources, revealed the twisted logic that had always characterized my parents' approach to fairness and family financial responsibility. Jason needs this help to get back on track, and family members should support each other during difficult times, Frank concluded, apparently believing that family obligation required me to sacrifice my financial future for Jason's temporary relief from gambling consequences that he would continue creating as long as his addiction remained untreated. But perhaps the most infuriating aspect of their announcement was their obvious expectation that I would immediately agree to their plan, as if my trust fund was family property that could be redistributed according to their assessment of who needed it most, rather than my personal inheritance that my grandmother had specifically designated for my individual benefit and protection. Have you ever sat quietly while family members announced their plan to steal your inheritance for someone else's addiction, knowing that their plan was about to fail because you had already protected your assets from their betrayal? That's exactly what I was experiencing as my parents revealed their intentions, while Jason sat smugly anticipating his financial rescue through my sacrifice. The devastating family betrayal was unfolding exactly as I had anticipated, but my trust fund was already safely beyond their reach regardless of how much pressure they planned to apply. The most revealing aspect of my parents' announcement about using my trust fund for Jason's gambling debts was their complete confidence that I would comply with their decision, treating my inheritance as family emergency funds rather than personal financial security that my grandmother had specifically protected for my individual benefit and independence. Margaret's elaboration on their expectations made it clear that they viewed my trust fund not as my personal inheritance, but as family money that should be available to solve Jason's problems, regardless of my own financial goals or my grandmother's explicit intentions about supporting my individual success and independence. We've already contacted the trust administrators to begin the paperwork process, Margaret announced, revealing that they had been planning this theft of my inheritance without consulting me or considering whether I might object to sacrificing my financial future for Jason's temporary relief from gambling consequences. The administrators explained that you'll need to sign some withdrawal authorizations first thing Monday morning, Frank added, presenting the theft as a procedural formality rather than a major financial decision that would eliminate my inheritance and leave me without the financial security my grandmother had worked to provide. The casual way they discussed liquidating my entire trust fund, as if my consent was a mere technicality rather than a fundamental requirement for accessing money that belonged to me legally and morally, revealed their complete disregard for my financial autonomy and personal rights as the beneficiary of my grandmother's careful planning. The family attorney says the process should be completed within a few days once you sign the necessary documents, Margaret continued, apparently having invested considerable time and effort in planning the theft of my inheritance while never considering whether I might refuse to participate in their scheme. But Jason's reaction to the announcement was perhaps even more infuriating than my parents' casual theft, because his smug satisfaction made it clear that he felt entitled to my inheritance as a solution to problems he had created through his own irresponsible choices and destructive behavior. "Thanks, Denise," Jason said, with obvious relief and entitlement, as if my inheritance was something he deserved, rather than something he was stealing through family pressure and emotional manipulation. "I really appreciate you helping me get back on my feet. This will solve everything, and I promise I'll be much more careful with money going forward." The promise to be more careful with money, while accepting a $680,000 bailout that would eliminate consequences for his gambling addiction, revealed Jason's complete lack of understanding about addiction recovery and personal accountability, suggesting that he viewed my inheritance as permission to continue gambling rather than motivation to seek proper treatment. "Family takes care of family," Margaret added, using emotional manipulation to justify the theft, while completely ignoring that her definition of family care involved sacrificing one child's financial future to enable another child's continued irresponsibility and destructive behavior. "You should be grateful for the opportunity to make such a meaningful contribution to Jason's recovery," Frank said, apparently believing that losing my inheritance should be viewed as a privilege rather than a devastating sacrifice that would eliminate my financial security and independence. The characterization of losing my trust fund as a meaningful contribution, while Jason received $680,000 without any accountability or behavior modification requirements, revealed my parents' complete inability to understand addiction, recovery, or the moral implications of their theft. This money will give Jason the fresh start he needs to rebuild his life and make better choices, Margaret continued, apparently believing that financial rescue would solve addiction problems that required professional treatment and genuine behavior change, rather than temporary relief from consequences. But the most disturbing aspect of their presentation was their obvious belief that I should be honored to sacrifice my inheritance for Jason's benefit, as if my grandmother's careful financial planning had been intended to provide emergency funding for family gambling debts rather than individual security and independence. Your grandmother would be proud to know that her financial gift is being used to help the family during a time of crisis, Frank said, completely misrepresenting my grandmother's intentions and values, while attempting to manipulate me into believing that theft of my inheritance somehow honored her memory and wishes. The suggestion that my grandmother, who had specifically structured the trust fund to protect my financial independence from family pressure, would approve of liquidating my inheritance for Jason's gambling debts, was so morally backwards that I struggled to maintain my composure while listening to their justifications. We know this is a big sacrifice, but we're confident that you'll make the right decision for the family, Margaret concluded, treating the theft as a moral test rather than acknowledging that they were asking me to destroy my financial future to enable Jason's continued addiction and irresponsibility. Throughout this entire presentation, I maintained complete silence, allowing my parents to reveal their true intentions and expectations, while they remained completely unaware that their plan to steal my inheritance was impossible, because I had already transferred the money beyond their reach months earlier. My strategic silence during their announcement served multiple purposes. It allowed them to fully expose their willingness to sacrifice my financial future for Jason's temporary convenience. It documented their expectations and justifications for anyone who might question their behavior, and it prevented them from adjusting their strategy based on my resistance or objections. So we'll meet at the trust administrator's office Monday morning at 9 o'clock to complete the paperwork, Frank announced, treating my compliance as inevitable while remaining completely unaware that Monday morning would bring devastating revelations about the actual security of my trust fund. This is really the best solution for everyone, Margaret added, apparently believing that eliminating my financial inheritance while enabling Jason's continued gambling would somehow benefit the entire family rather than just providing temporary relief that would make his addiction problems worse in the long term. Jason's final comment revealed his complete sense of entitlement and his expectation that family resources should be available to solve problems created by his irresponsible choices without requiring him to make difficult changes or accept accountability for his destructive behavior. I'm really looking forward to getting this debt situation resolved so I can focus on rebuilding my financial situation, Jason said, apparently viewing my inheritance as a convenient solution that would allow him to avoid the hard work of addiction recovery and behavior modification. But while Jason anticipated his financial rescue and my parents congratulated themselves on their solution to his gambling debts, I was quietly preparing for Monday morning revelations that would teach them all about the consequences of attempting to steal inheritance money that had been carefully protected from exactly this kind of family betrayal. Have you ever listened in silence while family members planned to steal your inheritance, knowing that their plan was about to fail spectacularly? That's exactly what I was experiencing as my parents and Jason made assumptions about my compliance while my trust fund remained safely protected from their reach. Monday morning would bring devastating education about the difference between planning theft and successfully executing it. My decision to maintain complete silence during my parents' announcement about stealing my trust fund was both strategic and necessary, allowing them to fully reveal their intentions and expectations while concealing the fact that their plan was impossible because I had already transferred my inheritance to accounts they could never access or control. The strategic value of my silence extended beyond just gathering intelligence about their betrayal. It also prevented them from modifying their approach or developing alternative pressure tactics that might be more difficult to counter if they understood that their primary plan was already doomed to fail. "We're so glad you understand the importance of helping Jason during this difficult time," Margaret said, interpreting my lack of objection as agreement with their decision to liquidate my inheritance for his gambling debts, rather than recognizing that my silence reflected my knowledge that their plan was impossible to execute. "This really shows what kind of person you are, Denise," Frank added, apparently believing that my quiet acceptance demonstrated family loyalty and generosity, rather than understanding that their theft attempt would fail regardless of my attitude or cooperation. But my silence also served another crucial purpose. It allowed me to observe Jason's reaction to his anticipated financial rescue and to document his sense of entitlement about receiving money that belonged to me legally and morally, providing clear evidence of his expectations and character. "I'm really grateful that this is going to work out," Jason said, his relief and satisfaction making it obvious that he viewed my inheritance as a solution to problems he had created, rather than a devastating sacrifice that would eliminate my financial security and independence. The weekend between Sunday's announcement and Monday's planned theft attempt passed slowly as I maintained my facade of compliance while internally preparing for the revelations that would expose my parents' betrayal and teach them about the consequences of attempting to steal carefully protected inheritance money. My parents spent the weekend making practical arrangements for what they believed would be a straightforward process of transferring my trust fund to Jason's creditors, apparently so confident in their plan that they made no contingency preparations for the possibility that their theft might not proceed as expected. "The attorney says everything should be processed by Wednesday if we complete the paperwork Monday morning," Margaret told family members during phone conversations that I overheard, clearly enjoying the prospect of solving Jason's problems through my sacrifice while maintaining her image as a supportive mother who protected her children. "Denise is being very mature about this whole situation," Frank told relatives who inquired about the family financial arrangements, portraying my silence as wisdom and cooperation rather than strategic preparation for their devastating disappointment. But Jason's behavior during the weekend was perhaps the most revealing aspect of their collective anticipation, as he began making plans for his post-debt lifestyle that demonstrated his complete lack of understanding about addiction recovery and personal accountability. "Once this debt situation is resolved, I'm going to be much more careful about my spending and gambling," Jason told family members, apparently viewing the elimination of consequences as motivation for behavior change rather than recognizing that addiction required professional treatment and genuine commitment to recovery. Monday morning arrived with my parents and Jason maintaining their confidence about the trust fund transfer, completely unaware that their plan was about to collapse in the most devastating and humiliating way possible, as they discovered that my inheritance was completely beyond their reach. I arrived at the trust administrator's office at the appointed time, maintaining my quiet demeanor while my parents and Jason anticipated their success in liquidating my financial future for his temporary relief from gambling consequences that would inevitably return without proper addiction treatment. "Good morning, Ms. Webb." The trust administrator greeted me professionally as my family gathered in the conference room where they expected to complete the paperwork that would transfer my inheritance to Jason's creditors and eliminate my financial independence. "We're here to complete the withdrawal authorizations for Denise's trust fund," Frank announced confidently, producing legal documents that he believed would facilitate the transfer of my inheritance to solve Jason's gambling debts, without considering the possibility that their plan might encounter obstacles. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion about the status of Ms. Webb's trust fund," the administrator replied, his tone suggesting complications that my parents had never anticipated or prepared for during their weekend of celebration about their successful theft strategy. "What kind of confusion?" Margaret asked, her confidence beginning to waver as she realized that their carefully planned theft might not proceed as smoothly as they had expected based on their assumptions about my compliance and cooperation. "Ms. Webb's trust fund assets were transferred to an offshore trust structure several months ago," the administrator explained, producing documentation that would soon devastate my parents' understanding of their ability to access my inheritance regardless of their pressure tactics or emotional manipulation. The revelation that my trust fund was no longer accessible through their local administrative procedures caused immediate panic and confusion as my parents began to understand that their plan to steal my inheritance had been impossible from the beginning. "Transferred to where?" Frank demanded, his voice rising with anger and disbelief as he realized that his assumption about controlling my financial assets had been completely wrong and that their theft plan was failing in ways he had never considered possible. "An offshore trust structure that provides comprehensive asset protection," the administrator continued, explaining the legal framework that I had established to prevent exactly the kind of family pressure and theft that my parents had been planning for weeks without my knowledge or consent. Ms. Webb completed all transfer procedures months ago, and the assets are now completely protected from any claims, legal proceedings, or administrative actions that might be attempted against her financial security, the administrator concluded, effectively ending any possibility that my parents could access my inheritance regardless of their threats, pressure tactics, or legal maneuvers. The shocking realization that their theft plan had been impossible from the beginning and that I had quietly protected my inheritance while allowing them to reveal their true intentions created a family crisis that exposed not only their willingness to steal from me, but also their complete inability to understand or anticipate consequences for their betrayal. "How did she do this without us knowing?" Margaret asked, apparently unable to process that I had been capable of sophisticated financial planning that protected my assets while maintaining the appearance of compliance with their expectations about family financial management. The transfer procedures were completed entirely within Ms. Webb's legal rights as the trust beneficiary, the administrator explained, making it clear that my asset protection was both legitimate and irreversible regardless of any family pressure or manipulation that might be applied to force me to surrender my financial independence. Jason's reaction to learning that his anticipated financial rescue was impossible was immediate and explosive, revealing his sense of entitlement about my inheritance and his complete inability to accept responsibility for problems created by his own gambling addiction and irresponsible behavior. "This isn't fair!" Jason shouted, his anger and desperation making it obvious that he had been counting on my inheritance to solve his problems without requiring him to address his gambling addiction or make the difficult changes necessary for genuine recovery and accountability. But perhaps the most satisfying moment of Monday morning was watching my parents realize that their confident assumption about controlling my financial assets had been completely wrong, and that their willingness to sacrifice my inheritance for Jason's temporary convenience had been exposed without achieving any of their intended goals. Have you ever watched family members discover that their plan to steal your inheritance was impossible because you had anticipated their betrayal and protected your assets months in advance? That's exactly what I experienced as my parents, and Jason learned that their assumptions about my compliance had been as wrong as their beliefs about their ability to access my carefully protected trust fund. The devastating consequences of their failed theft attempt were just beginning to unfold. The immediate aftermath of my parents' failed attempt to steal my trust fund created a family crisis that exposed not only their willingness to sacrifice my financial future for Jason's temporary convenience, but also their complete inability to understand or accept responsibility for the consequences of their betrayal and the devastating damage they had caused to our relationships. The administrator's explanation that my trust fund was completely protected from their access attempts had eliminated any possibility that they could force me to sacrifice my inheritance, but it had also revealed the extent of their planning and preparation for theft that demonstrated their systematic betrayal rather than impulsive family financial management. "We need to discuss this situation privately as a family," Frank demanded, clearly hoping to move the conversation away from professional witnesses who had observed their attempted theft and who could testify about their intentions and expectations regarding my inheritance. "There's nothing to discuss," I replied calmly, speaking for the first time since their theft plan had collapsed, and finally revealing that my silence had been strategic rather than compliant. You've made your intentions clear, and I've made my response clear. The trust fund is protected, and it will remain protected. The shock on my parents' faces as they realized that my quiet demeanor had concealed sophisticated planning rather than passive acceptance was both satisfying and devastating, because it meant acknowledging that they had completely misjudged my character and capabilities while revealing their own moral failures. "Denise, you deliberately deceived us about your financial arrangements," Margaret accused, apparently believing that my failure to inform them about asset protection was somehow more problematic than their plan to steal my inheritance without my consent or knowledge. "I protected my inheritance from people who proved they couldn't be trusted with information about my financial security," I replied, pointing out that their current anger about being excluded from my financial planning was exactly why such protection had been necessary and appropriate. Jason's reaction to learning that his anticipated financial rescue was impossible revealed the depth of his entitlement and his complete inability to accept that his gambling problems were his responsibility rather than obligations that other family members should solve through personal sacrifice. "You knew I needed help, and you let me think this money was going to solve my problems," Jason accused, apparently believing that I owed him advance notice about the security of my inheritance so he could make alternative arrangements for avoiding consequences of his gambling addiction. "I knew you needed treatment for gambling addiction, not a financial bailout that would enable continued irresponsible behavior," I replied, finally expressing the truth about his situation that my parents had been unwilling to acknowledge despite years of evidence about the ineffectiveness of their enabling responses. The family meeting that followed our departure from the trust administrator's office was the most honest conversation we had ever had about money, responsibility, and the consequences of enabling destructive behavior while sacrificing other family members' security and independence. "How could you be so selfish about family financial needs?" Margaret demanded, still refusing to acknowledge that stealing my inheritance would have been theft rather than legitimate family financial planning that I should have supported enthusiastically. "How could you be so willing to steal my inheritance for Jason's gambling debts while calling it family support?" I countered, forcing her to confront the moral reality of what they had been planning and the devastating impact it would have had on my financial future. The extended argument that followed revealed fundamental differences in our understanding of family obligation, personal responsibility, and the appropriate response to addiction that made it clear our relationships had been permanently damaged by their willingness to sacrifice my inheritance for Jason's temporary convenience. "Jason is your brother, and family members should help each other during difficult times," Frank argued, still attempting to justify theft through emotional manipulation and appeals to family loyalty that ignored the distinction between genuine help and enabling destructive behavior. Genuine help would involve supporting Jason's recovery from gambling addiction, not giving him money that eliminates consequences while teaching him that family resources will always be available to solve problems created by his irresponsible choices, I replied, explaining the difference between assistance and enablement that my parents had never understood despite years of failed interventions. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of the family confrontation was my parents' complete inability to acknowledge that their theft plan had been morally wrong, instead focusing their anger on my successful protection of assets rather than examining their own willingness to sacrifice my financial future. "You've destroyed this family by being secretive and manipulative about money," Margaret accused, apparently believing that my asset protection was more damaging to family relationships than their plan to steal my inheritance without consent or consideration for my financial goals. "You destroyed this family by planning to steal my inheritance while pretending to care about my well-being and future," I replied, pointing out that their betrayal had been the decisive factor in permanently altering our relationships, regardless of how they chose to characterize my defensive responses. The conversation continued for hours without resolution because my parents and Jason remained committed to believing that I owed them access to my inheritance while I was equally committed to protecting my financial independence from people who had demonstrated they couldn't be trusted with my security or well-being. "We're not going to continue having a relationship with someone who refuses to help family during emergencies," Frank announced, apparently believing that threatening to cut off contact would pressure me into reconsidering my protection of assets that belonged to me legally and morally. "That's your choice to make," I replied, accepting that our relationships were ending because of their unwillingness to respect my financial autonomy and their continued commitment to enabling Jason's destructive behavior through other people's sacrifice. The permanent estrangement that resulted from their failed theft attempt was both painful and liberating, because it freed me from family relationships that had been built on their expectation that I would sacrifice my own interests whenever Jason's irresponsible choices created problems that required external solutions. Jason's gambling debts remained unpaid after their failed attempt to access my trust fund, creating ongoing pressure and consequences that would ultimately force him to face reality about his addiction rather than relying on family bailouts that had enabled his destructive behavior for years. "This is all your fault," Jason told me during our final conversation, apparently unable to accept that his gambling addiction and debt problems were his responsibility rather than obligations that I should have solved through personal financial sacrifice. "This is all the consequence of your choices," I replied, finally stating the truth about personal responsibility that my family had been avoiding for years while expecting other people to solve problems created by Jason's irresponsible behavior. The months following my parents' failed theft attempt were marked by their ongoing financial struggle to help Jason avoid consequences for his gambling debts, ultimately depleting their own savings and retirement security, while learning that enabling destructive behavior was expensive and ineffective. Meanwhile, my protected trust fund allowed me to pursue opportunities and goals that would have been impossible if my inheritance had been liquidated for Jason's temporary relief, validating every aspect of my decision to anticipate family betrayal and protect my financial independence from people who viewed my security as disposable family emergency funds. Have you ever protected your assets from family members who plan to steal your inheritance while calling it family support? The satisfaction of watching their theft plan fail is exceeded only by the freedom that comes from escaping relationships built on your sacrifice for other people's irresponsibility. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to enable their dysfunction, even when it means accepting that your relationships will end because they can't respect your boundaries or accept responsibility for their own choices. The long-term consequences of my parents' failed attempt to steal my trust fund extended far beyond just the immediate crisis of Jason's unpaid gambling debts, creating permanent changes in our family dynamics that revealed fundamental differences in our values regarding money, responsibility, and the appropriate response to destructive behavior that made reconciliation impossible. The months following their unsuccessful theft plan were marked by my parents' desperate attempts to solve Jason's debt problems through other means, ultimately depleting their own retirement savings and creating financial stress that made them understand, too late, the value of the inheritance they had tried to steal from me. Margaret and Frank's decision to use their own money to pay Jason's gambling debts resulted in the liquidation of investments and savings accounts that had been intended to support their comfortable retirement, forcing them to accept reduced living standards and financial insecurity that mirrored the situation they had planned to impose on me. We had to use our retirement funds to help Jason avoid serious consequences from his creditors, Margaret explained to relatives who questioned their financial decisions, apparently still believing that enabling Jason's irresponsible behavior was more important than protecting their own security or respecting my inheritance. The irony that my parents had destroyed their own financial future to enable Jason's gambling addiction, while failing to steal mine, was not lost on family members who had witnessed the entire sequence of events and understood the devastating consequences of prioritizing enablement over accountability. Jason's response to his parents' financial sacrifice was predictably entitled and ungrateful, treating their retirement fund liquidation as insufficient assistance rather than recognizing the devastating impact his addiction had on people who loved him enough to destroy their own security for his temporary convenience. The money Mom and Dad gave me helped with the immediate debt problems, but I'm still facing financial pressure and need additional family support to get completely stable, Jason told relatives, apparently viewing his parents' retirement fund sacrifice as the beginning of family financial obligation rather than an extraordinary gesture that should have motivated genuine behavior change. The pattern that emerged over the following year was both predictable and devastating. Jason's continued gambling created new debt problems that consumed additional family resources, while my parents faced increasing financial pressure and social embarrassment about their reduced circumstances. Meanwhile, my protected trust fund allowed me to pursue opportunities that validated every aspect of my decision to anticipate family betrayal and protect my inheritance from people who viewed my financial security as disposable emergency funding for Jason's irresponsible choices. The MBA program I was able to attend using trust fund resources provided advanced business education that enhanced my career prospects while demonstrating the value of my grandmother's investment in my future, rather than in family crisis management and addiction enablement. Your academic performance and leadership potential make you exactly the kind of graduate our program is designed to develop, wrote Professor Michael Chen in a recommendation letter that reflected the opportunities made possible by protecting my inheritance from family theft. The small business I launched after completing my MBA was both personally fulfilling and financially successful, providing independence and achievement that honored my grandmother's intentions while demonstrating the long-term value of protecting educational and entrepreneurial resources from family pressure and manipulation. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome of protecting my trust fund was the establishment of the Eleanor Webb Foundation, a charitable organization that provides financial education and addiction recovery support for families dealing with gambling problems while protecting individual financial security from family pressure. The Webb Foundation represents exactly the kind of positive social impact that demonstrates the value of protecting inheritance money from family dysfunction, explained Dr. Patricia Williams, the addiction counselor who served on the Foundation's advisory board. The Foundation's work with families affected by gambling addiction provided ongoing validation of my decision to refuse enabling Jason's destructive behavior, as we documented case after case where financial bailouts delayed recovery and created additional problems for everyone involved. Families who provide financial solutions to gambling addiction typically discover that their sacrifice makes the addiction worse rather than better, Dr. Williams explained during Foundation training sessions. Effective addiction recovery requires personal accountability and professional treatment, not family financial rescue that eliminates consequences. 5 years after my parents' failed attempt to steal my trust fund, Jason's gambling addiction remained untreated and uncontrolled, having consumed not only my parents' retirement savings, but also creating ongoing debt problems that continued to threaten his personal relationships and financial stability. Margaret and Frank's reduced financial circumstances forced them to accept assistance from other family members and community resources, learning too late that their enabling responses to Jason's addiction had been expensive failures that damaged everyone involved while providing no lasting solutions. "We thought we were helping Jason by solving his financial problems," Margaret admitted during a chance encounter at a community event, "but he just created new debts and expected more family assistance. We should have listened when you said that giving him money wouldn't solve his addiction." The acknowledgement that my approach to Jason's gambling problem had been correct was both satisfying and sad, because it came too late to repair the family relationships that had been destroyed by their willingness to steal my inheritance for his temporary convenience. My own life had flourished in ways that demonstrated the wisdom of protecting inheritance money from family pressure, while using educational and entrepreneurial opportunities to create lasting value rather than temporary crisis management. The successful business ventures, educational achievements, and charitable impact that my trust fund had made possible represented exactly the kind of long-term benefit that my grandmother had envisioned when she established financial protection for my individual development and independence. But perhaps the most important lesson from my family's crisis was understanding that some relationships cannot survive fundamental differences in values regarding money, responsibility, and the appropriate response to destructive behavior that makes compromise impossible. "You made the right choice to protect your inheritance," wrote Dr. Sarah Martinez, a family counselor who had worked with our family during the immediate aftermath of the theft attempt. Enabling addiction through financial rescue typically makes problems worse while damaging the relationships that families are trying to protect. The peace and independence that came from escaping family relationships built on my sacrifice for other people's irresponsibility was more valuable than any monetary inheritance, because it allowed me to build a life based on my own values rather than constantly managing other people's crises and expectations. If you're facing family pressure to sacrifice your inheritance or financial security for someone else's addiction or irresponsible behavior, please know that protecting your assets is both legally appropriate and morally necessary for your own well-being and independence. Anticipating family betrayal and taking protective action isn't paranoid or selfish. It's smart financial planning that ensures your resources serve their intended purpose, rather than enabling destructive behavior that harms everyone involved, including the person you're trying to help. Have you ever had to choose between protecting your financial future and enabling a family member's addiction? The decision to protect your inheritance may be difficult, but it's often the most loving choice for everyone involved, even when they can't understand or appreciate your wisdom. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Remember that your financial security belongs to you, and family members who would steal your inheritance to enable addiction deserve to face the consequences of both their betrayal and the problems they're trying to solve. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is allowing them to experience the full weight of their choices without your financial rescue. See you in our next story here on Her Sweet Revenge.